The dust stung Caleb's one good eye. A devil wind, building fast, clawed at his poncho. He squinted, spitting grit. Usually he'd ride it out, find a hollow, let the storm pass. But something caught his eye. A covered wagon, canvas ripped and flapping like a wounded bird, sitting starts against the bruised sky. Abandoned. He urged his horse, a sturdy Appaloosa named Ghost, forward. The wagon listed, one wheel sunk deep in the cracked earth. No sign of life. Caleb dismounted, the wind nearly ripping the reins from his gloved hand. He tied Ghost to the buckboard, the horse already restless, sensing the coming fury. The wagon door hung open, banging in the wind. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale sweat and fear. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the Colt Peacemaker, strapped to his hip, a familiar comfort. He stepped inside, his boots crunching on broken glass and discarded belongings. That's when he saw her. She was chained to the wagon wheel, a thin chain biting into her ankle. A young woman, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes wide with a terror that ran deeper than the storm outside. Her left leg was gone below the knee, crudely bandaged. She was Chinese, her dark hair pulled back in a tight braid. Caleb's jaw tightened. He'd seen enough cruelty in his time, enough men left for dead in the unforgiving West. But this was something else. He recognized the brand seared into the wagon's wood. The Lazy S, belonging to Silas Thorne, a man known for his ruthlessness and a particular hatred for anyone not born white. He knelt beside her, ignoring the rising wind that howled through the wagon's tattered canvas. He pulled out his Bowie knife, the blade gleaming dully in the dim light. He didn't speak. Words were wasted on men like Thorne. Words were wasted on a dying woman. He saw her flinch as he reached for the chain. He met her gaze, his one eye holding a lifetime of hardship, but also a flicker of something else. Maybe not hope, but maybe a promise. He began to saw at the chain, the metal protesting with a high-pitched whine that was almost lost in the roar of the wind. He worked quickly, efficiently, his movements practiced, honed by years of survival in a land that offered little mercy. The chain finally gave, the last link snapping with a dull thud. Caleb tossed the severed metal aside. The girl, May, didn't move. She just stared at the open shackle, her ankle raw and bleeding. The wind howled louder now, rattling the wagon like a skeleton in a box. He reached for her, his calloused hand hovering. She flinched again, drawing back as far as the wagon wall allowed. He understood. Trust didn't come easy in this land, especially not for someone like her, chained and broken. He slowly withdrew his hand. Instead, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn blanket. He offered it to her, holding it out without a word. She hesitated, her eyes darting between the blanket, his face, and the storm raging outside. Finally, she reached out, her fingers brushing his, as she took the offered warmth. He hoisted her up, careful of her injured leg. She was light, too light. He carried her out of the wagon, the wind whipping her hair across his face. Ghost shifted nervously, but stood his ground. Caleb settled May gently onto the horse, positioning her as comfortably as he could. He mounted behind her, one arm a steady brace around her. "Hold on," he said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the wind. It was the first word he'd spoken since finding her. He turned Ghost into the teeth of the storm. Rain lashed down, turning the dust to mud. The wagon and the horrors it held receded behind them. He knew Thorne wouldn't let this go. But for now, all that mattered was getting May out of the storm, getting her somewhere safe. Hours later, the storm began to break. The bruised sky bled into shades of orange and purple. They crested a rise, and in the distance, nestled in a shallow valley, lay redemption. It was a ghost town, clinging to life like a stubborn weed. A few ramshackle buildings huddled around a dusty main street, most boarded up and decaying. Smoke curled from the chimney of the saloon, the only sign of habitation. Caleb urged Ghost down the slope. The wind still buffeted them, but the worst had passed. As they rode into redemption, a mangy dog barked half-heartedly from beneath the porch of the general store. A few faces peered out from behind dusty windows, curious but wary. He stopped in front of the saloon, its false front peeling and faded. He dismounted, then carefully lifted May from the horse. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and haunted. He carried her inside. The saloon was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale beer and sawdust. A grizzled bartender wiped down the counter with a rag, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of Caleb carrying the Chinese woman. "What's this, Caleb?" he asked, his voice gruff. "She needs help, Jed," Caleb said, his voice flat. Jed grunted but didn't argue. He knew better than to cross Caleb. He jerked his head towards the stairs at the back of the saloon. Upstairs. Back room. Caleb carried May up the creaking stairs. The back room was small and sparsely furnished, containing only a cot, a table, and a chair. He laid her gently on the cot. He went downstairs and returned with a bucket of water and some clean rags. He knelt beside her, his touch gentle despite his rough exterior. He began to clean her wounds, his movements careful and precise. He cleaned the dirt from her face, revealing delicate features and high cheekbones. He cleaned the raw skin around the shackle mark on her ankle. He rebandaged her leg, his brow furrowed in concentration. As he worked, May watched him warily, her eyes mirroring the vast, empty landscape. He saw the fear in them, the pain. He knew he couldn't erase what had happened to her. But maybe, just maybe, he could help her find a little peace. He remembered another time, another woman, another battle. He remembered the screams, the blood, the loss. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, the rage that burned inside him. He'd lost his arm in that fight, but he'd lost something else too, a piece of his soul. He looked at May, her fragile form lying on the cot. He saw a reflection of his own pain, his own brokenness. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't turn away. He couldn't leave her to face the world alone. He stood up, his back aching. He looked down at her, his one eye holding a silent promise. He would protect her. He didn't know why, didn't understand the pull he felt towards this broken woman. But he knew he couldn't abandon her. He left the room, closing the door softly behind him. Downstairs, the saloon was slowly filling with the evening crowd. Men, weathered and worn, nursed their drinks, their eyes following Caleb's every move. Whispers snaked through the room, hushed and laced with suspicion. "Chinawoman," he heard someone mutter. "Bad luck." Caleb ignored them. He walked to the bar, his spurs clicking on the wooden floor. He slammed a silver dollar down on the counter. "Jed," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Soup. Bread. Anything you got?" Jed nodded, his face unreadable. He poured Caleb a shot of whiskey, then went to the back, returning a few minutes later, with a bowl of thin broth and a hunk of stale bread. Caleb took the food upstairs. May hadn't moved. She lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, her eyes wide and unfocused. He knelt beside her, offering her the bowl. "Eat," he said, his voice gentle. She didn't respond. He dipped a piece of bread in the soup and held it to her lips. She hesitated, then slowly opened her mouth. She chewed slowly, her eyes still fixed on the ceiling. He fed her a few more bites, then set the bowl down on the table. He pulled the worn blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders. "Rest," he said. He left the room again, leaving the door slightly ajar. He sat on the stairs, his back against the wall, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. He knew the men downstairs were watching him, judging him. He didn't care. He would protect her, even if it meant facing the prejudice and hatred of the entire town. The next few days passed in a blur. Caleb tended to May's wounds, bringing her food and water. He cleaned the room, trying to make it as comfortable as possible. He didn't speak much, but he made sure she knew she wasn't alone. May remained withdrawn, her eyes haunted. She spoke little English, but Caleb understood her fear. He learned a few words of Cantonese, enough to ask her if she was hungry or in pain. She would nod or shake her head, her expression rarely changing. One evening, as Caleb was cleaning her wound, Mai reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were light, hesitant. He looked up at her, his one eye questioning. She said something in Cantonese, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. Gratitude. He smiled, a rare and fleeting expression. He squeezed her hand gently, then returned to his task. Later that night, as he sat on the stairs, he heard Mai singing. It was a soft, mournful melody, a song of loss and longing. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the pain. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over him. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there was still beauty to be found. He knew that their journey was far from over. Silas Thorne would come looking for Mai. The townspeople would continue to whisper and stare. But for now, in this small, forgotten town, they had found a fragile connection, a shared understanding in a world that offered little kindness. And that, he thought, was enough. For now. The mournful melody faded with the dying light. Caleb remained on the stairs, the saloon's murmur, a low drone beneath May's song. He knew it couldn't last. This fragile peace, this shared silence, was a bubble waiting to burst. The bubble burst with the thunder of hooves. Dust billowed, choking the air. The saloon doors swung inward, revealing a silhouette against the setting sun. A man broad and imposing, flanked by two shadows equally menacing. Jebediah Thorne. Caleb rose slowly, his hand instinctively finding the worn handle of his peacemaker. He descended the stairs, each step deliberate, his face a mask of weathered stone. The saloon fell silent, every eye drawn to the unfolding drama. Thorne swaggered forward, his gaze sweeping the room, then fixing on Caleb. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice thick with contempt. "Look what the cat dragged in. One-eye Caleb, still clinging to life, I see." Caleb didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his one eye unwavering. "Thorne," he acknowledged, his voice a low rumble. "Heard you found something of mine." Thorne continued, his eyes glinting with malice. "A little investment that wandered off. A China woman, answers to Mai." The word hung in the air, heavy with venom. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew this was coming. "She ain't yours," Caleb said, his voice flat. Thorne let out a harsh laugh. "Ain't mine? I got papers, Caleb. Bought and paid for. She belongs to me, lock, stock, and barrel." He spat on the floor, the spittle landing inches from Caleb's boots. "Now, step aside, old man. I ain't got time for games." Caleb didn't move. His lone arm, a stark reminder of past battles, hung loose at his side. But his stance was firm, unyielding. "She stays here," he stated, his voice laced with steel. The two men flanking Thorne shifted, their hands hovering near their holstered guns. The air thickened, charged with unspoken threats. The dust motes danced in the fading sunlight, swirling like restless spirits caught between two worlds. You're making a mistake, Caleb, Thorne warned, his voice hardening. A big one. You don't want to cross me. I'm a patient man, but I ain't a forgiving one. I ain't afraid of you, Thorne, Caleb replied, his voice barely audible above the rising tension. And I ain't letting you take her. Thorne's face twisted in a sneer. So, that's how it's gonna be, huh? You want to play the hero? Fine by me. Boys, he said, turning to his men, take her. And if the old cripple gets in your way, put him down. The two men stepped forward, their eyes cold and devoid of emotion. They moved with a practiced efficiency, their hands already drawing their weapons. The saloon held its breath, waiting for the inevitable explosion of violence. Caleb stood alone, a solitary figure against the encroaching darkness, but his resolve remained unbroken. He would protect May, even if it cost him everything. The two men flanking Thorne spread out, cutting off any escape. They were professionals, gunslicks who'd seen too much dust and too little mercy. Caleb knew a gunfight here, in the crowded saloon, meant innocent blood spilled. He needed another way. Hold up, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. Thorne, you want her that bad. Let's settle this like men. Thorne paused, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. Settle it how, old man? You gonna challenge me to a duel? I'd hate to waste the lead. Poker, Caleb said, his voice steady. One hand. Winner takes May. Loser walks away. A murmur rippled through the saloon. Poker was a language these men understood. It was a game of chance, but also of skill, of reading faces and playing the odds. It was a gamble, just like life in the West. Thorne considered for a moment, his eyes narrowed. He liked the odds. Caleb was old, crippled, and likely out of practice. He couldn't resist the chance to humiliate him, to take what he wanted, and leave the old man with nothing. All right, One Eye, Thorne said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. You got yourself a game. But the stakes are high. If you lose, you leave this town. Forever. And Mai comes with me. No arguments. Agreed, Caleb said, his voice unwavering. Jed, the bartender, cleared a space on the counter, wiping it down with a rag. He produced a deck of cards, well worn and greasy from years of use. He dealt them with practiced ease, the snap of the cards the only sound in the hushed saloon. The men gathered around, their faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight. The air was thick with smoke and anticipation. Mai watched from the shadows at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. Her fate hung in the balance, determined by the turn of a card. Caleb picked up his cards, his face betraying nothing. He'd played poker in every dusty town, from the Pecos to the Platte. He'd won fortunes and lost them, learned to read men like open books. He'd seen the desperation in their eyes, the flicker of a tell, the subtle twitch that revealed their hand. He remembered a smoky backroom in San Antonio, the clinking of glasses, the smell of cheap whiskey. He was younger then, faster, his pockets full of cash. He'd been a shark, preying on unsuspecting greenhorns. He'd won enough that night to buy a small ranch, a dream that had withered and died with his wife. He looked at his hand. Not great, but neat terrible. He could work with it. He met Thorne's gaze, his one eye boring into him. Thorne held a smirk, confident in his hand. I'll open, Thorne said, tossing a stack of bills onto the counter. $50. Caleb didn't flinch. He knew Thorne was trying to intimidate him, to force him to fold. But he wouldn't be intimidated. He'd faced down worse odds than this. I'll see your 50, Caleb said, his voice calm, and raise you. Everything I own. A collective gasp swept through the saloon. Every eye turned to Caleb. Disbelief etched on their faces. He was betting everything, his meager savings, his worn saddle, the few possessions he had left. He was betting his life. Thorne's smirk faltered. He hadn't expected this. He'd thought Caleb would fold, would back down. But the old man was serious. He was all in. The saloon fell silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Thorne stared at Caleb, his eyes narrowed, trying to gauge the old man's sincerity. He couldn't believe Caleb would risk everything on one hand of cards. It was reckless, foolish. Or was it? A seed of doubt began to sprout in Thorne's mind. Was this a bluff? Was Caleb holding a royal flush? He looked at his own hand again. A good hand, 2 pair. Aces and eights, enough to win most games. But against Caleb, against the weight of the old man's gaze, it suddenly felt inadequate. "You're bluffing," Thorne said, his voice tight. "You ain't got nothing." Caleb didn't reply. He simply stared back, his one eye holding a depth of experience that Thorne couldn't fathom. Thorne hesitated, his fingers drumming on the table. He could fold, walk away with his pride intact. But the thought of losing to Caleb, of letting the Chinawoman slip through his fingers, was unbearable. He had come too far, invested too much. "I call," he said finally, his voice laced with a mixture of triumph and trepidation. Caleb slowly laid down his cards one by one. A 7 of diamonds, a 9 of clubs, a 10 of hearts, a jack of spades, and finally, a queen of diamonds. Nothing. Just a queen high. A collective gasp filled the saloon. Thorne's face erupted in a triumphant grin. He slammed his cards down on the table, revealing his 2 pair. "Aces and eights," he roared, his voice booming through the room. "I win. The Chinawoman is mine." He reached across the table, grabbing the stack of bills Caleb had pushed forward. His men cheered, their eyes gleaming with avarice. Thorne stood up, his chest puffed out, savoring his victory. "Well, One Eye," he sneered, "looks like you lost. Time to pack your bags and get out of town. And don't forget to say goodbye to your little friend." He turned towards the stairs, his hand outstretched, ready to claim his prize. But Caleb didn't move. He remained seated at the table, his face impassive. "There's one thing you don't know, Thorne," he said, his voice calm and steady. Thorne paused, his smile faltering. "And what's that, old man?" "May ain't alone in this world," Caleb said. "She's got family. Powerful family." Thorne laughed. "Family? A Chinawoman in this godforsaken town. Don't make me laugh." "I sent a message," Caleb continued, ignoring Thorne's mockery. "By stagecoach. To San Francisco." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "San Francisco? What are you talking about?" "Her name ain't just May," Caleb said. "It's May Lean. And her uncle is Jing. Jing, the riverboat king. He's been looking for her ever since she was taken from her village. And he ain't gonna be happy when he finds out what you've done." A chill ran down Thorne's spine. He knew the name Jing. Everyone did. He was a powerful man, a force to be reckoned with in San Francisco's Chinatown. He controlled the river traffic, the gambling dens, the opium trade. He was a man you didn't want to cross. The color drained from Thorne's face. He looked from Caleb to May, his eyes filled with a sudden, chilling realization. He had won the battle, but he may have just lost the war. Thorne's bravado evaporated like morning mist. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the saloon, searching for a way out. "You're lying," he stammered, but the conviction was gone. He wouldn't send men all the way out here for some woman. Caleb just stared at him, his silence more damning than any accusation. He knew Thorne was caught, trapped in a web of his own making. The riverboat king's reach was long, his vengeance swift and brutal. Suddenly Thorne roared, a desperate sound of defiance. "I don't care about your Chinaman." He lunged for May, his hand outstretched, intending to drag her down from the stairs. "She's mine, and I'm taking her." Caleb moved with a speed that belied his age and injury. He shoved the poker table aside, sending cards and coins scattering across the floor. He stepped in front of Thorne, blocking his path. "You ain't touching her," he growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Thorne shoved Caleb, the force of the blow sending the old man stumbling back. He grabbed May's arm, yanking her down the stairs. She cried out, her small frame struggling against his grip. "Get off me!" she screamed, her voice filled with terror. Thorne ignored her pleas, dragging her towards the door. His men, momentarily stunned by the sudden turn of events, scrambled to react. Caleb scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of fury. He grabbed a broken chair leg, the splintered wood, a makeshift weapon. He charged at Thorne, swinging the chair leg with surprising force. The wood connected with Thorne's back, sending him sprawling forward, releasing his grip on Mo. She stumbled, falling to the dusty floor. "Run, May!" Caleb yelled, his voice hoarse. "Get out of here!" Mo scrambled to her feet and fled out the back door of the saloon, disappearing into the maze of abandoned buildings that comprised the ghost town. Thorne roared with rage, scrambling to his feet. He turned to his men, his face contorted with fury. "Get her!" he screamed. "Don't let her escape." The two men hesitated for a moment, glancing at Caleb. But the promise of Thorne's wrath was more immediate than the threat of the one-armed old man. They raced out the back door, hot on May's trail. Caleb knew he had to buy her time. He stood his ground, the broken chair leg his only defense. Thorne charged at him, his fists clenched, his eyes filled with hate. The saloon erupted in a brawl. Punches flew, chairs splintered, and the air filled with the sounds of grunts and curses. Caleb, despite his age and disability, fought with a ferocity born of desperation. He dodged and weaved, using his one good arm to deliver surprisingly powerful blows. He was protecting not just May, but a piece of his own lost humanity. Outside, Mai ran blindly through the deserted streets, her lungs burning, her heart pounding in her chest. The ghost town was a labyrinth of crumbling buildings and overgrown weeds, a desolate landscape that offered little refuge. She could hear the heavy footsteps of Thorne's men, gaining on her, their voices growing closer. She stumbled and fell, scraping her knees on the rough ground. She looked back, her eyes filled with terror. The two men were closing in, their faces grim and determined. She knew she couldn't outrun them. She was small, weak, and unfamiliar with the terrain. She was trapped. But May was not as helpless as she appeared. Years of hardship had hardened her, taught her resilience and cunning. She had survived poverty, loss, and the cruelty of strangers. She would not surrender now. She spotted a narrow alleyway between two buildings, a dark and shadowy passage that offered a sliver of hope. She darted into the alley, hoping to lose her pursuers in the darkness. The alley opened onto a narrow wash, a dry creek bed, choked with scrub brush and loose shale. Mai scrambled down the embankment, her bare feet slipping on the treacherous terrain. The voices of Thorne's men echoed behind her, closer now. She had to find somewhere to hide, somewhere they wouldn't think to look. She pressed on, deeper into the wash, the canyon walls rising on either side, offering a sliver of shade from the harsh afternoon sun. The wash twisted and turned, a natural maze that might offer her a chance. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead, blocking her path. It was Jedediah, Thorne's right-hand man, a hulking brute with a face like granite. He grinned, a cruel, predatory expression that sent a shiver down May's spine. "Nowhere left to run, little bird," he said, his voice a gravelly growl. "Thorne wants you back, and I aim to deliver." May knew she was trapped. The canyon walls offered no escape, and Jedediah was too strong for her to fight. Her heart sank, her hope dwindling. But then a shot rang out, echoing through the canyon. Jedediah staggered back, clutching his arm, a look of surprise on his face. He roared in pain and anger, his eyes scanning the canyon walls. Caleb emerged from behind a cluster of boulders, his rifle still smoking. He moved with surprising agility, his one good arm steady as he reloaded. "Get behind me, May," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We ain't done yet." He knew they were cornered. The canyon was a natural trap, and Thorne's men would be closing in fast. But he wouldn't let them take May. He'd fight to the last breath. "We can't stay here," May said, her voice trembling. "They'll surround us." "I know," Caleb said, "but we got a few tricks left. This canyon ain't just rocks and dust. It's got its secrets." He led her deeper into the canyon, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. He pointed out a narrow ledge high above, almost invisible against the canyon wall. "See that?" he said. "That's where we're going." He knew it was a long shot. The climb was treacherous, and they were both exhausted. But it was their only chance. He boosted May up onto a rocky outcrop, then followed, his injured leg protesting with every step. They began to climb, their hands and feet finding purchase on the rough rock. The sun beat down on them, sweat stinging their eyes. Below, Thorne and his remaining man, Slade, entered the wash. Thorne was livid, his face contorted with rage. "Find them," he roared. "I want them alive, especially that old buzzard." Thorne and Slade began to move through the canyon, their eyes searching the rocks and crevices. Thorne, consumed with fury, didn't notice the subtle signs. A disturbed patch of dust, a dislodged pebble, a faint scent of gunpowder. Caleb had been busy. As Thorne rounded a bend, he triggered a tripwire, sending a cascade of rocks tumbling down from above. The rocks crashed down around him, narrowly missing him, but forcing him to scramble for cover. "Damn it!" he yelled, his voice echoing through the canyon. "He's set traps." Caleb and May, clinging to the ledge above, watched as Thorne raged below. Caleb whispered to May, "Stay close, stay quiet. We ain't safe yet." He knew this was just a temporary reprieve. Thorne was relentless, and he wouldn't give up easily. But Caleb was determined to protect May, even if it meant sacrificing everything. He had found a purpose, a reason to fight, in this desolate corner of the world. He would use every trick he knew, every ounce of strength he possessed, to keep her safe. He owed her that much. He owed himself that much. The echoes of the rockslide still reverberated through the canyon, a chaotic symphony of crashing stone and Thorne's frustrated curses. Dust billowed, obscuring the narrow passage below. Caleb, clinging to the ledge with May pressed close behind him, watched the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. "A little Gettysburg trick," he muttered, more to himself than May. "Works every time." He knew the rockslide wouldn't stop Thorne for long. The man was too driven, too consumed by his own greed and rage. But it bought them time, precious moments, to put more distance between them and their pursuers. They continued their ascent, the climb growing steeper, the handholds scarcer. May, despite her fear and exhaustion, moved with a surprising determination. She seemed to draw strength from Caleb's unwavering resolve, her small hands gripping the rock with surprising force. Finally, they reached the top of the ledge, a narrow plateau overlooking the canyon. Caleb collapsed against a boulder, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His leg throbbed, a dull, persistent ache that reminded him of the shrapnel still lodged deep within his flesh. Mai sat beside him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. "Thank you, Caleb," she whispered, "for saving me." Caleb waved a dismissive hand, his gaze fixed on the canyon below. "Ain't saved you yet, child. Just bought us some time." He paused, his face clouding with a distant memory. He rarely spoke of his past, preferring to keep the ghosts buried deep. But something about May, her vulnerability, her quiet strength, reminded him of things he'd long tried to forget. "Gettysburg," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "That's where I lost this." He gestured to his missing arm, a phantom ache radiating from the empty sleeve. "And more than just a limb. Lost my brother there too. Caught a rebel bullet, right through the heart. Only family I ever had." He looked at May, his one eye filled with a profound sadness. "Saw a lot of things in that war, child. Things no one should ever see. Things that change a man. Forever." He paused, his gaze softening. "Reminded me of you. Seeing Thorne drag you like a sack of feed. Helpless, just like they were. Like we all were." He spat, the sound harsh in the still air. Never wanted to see that again. He reached out, his calloused hand gently touching her cheek. "Don't want to see history repeat itself, Mai. Some things ain't worth the price." He pulled back his hand, his gaze hardening once more. "Come on," he said, his voice regaining its gruffness. "We gotta keep moving. They'll be on us soon." He knew the risks were high. He was an old man, injured and outnumbered. But he had made a promise, both to May and to himself. He wouldn't let her fall into Thorne's hands. He would fight to the bitter end, even if it meant facing the ghosts of his past and the brutal realities of the present. For in protecting her, he was, in a way, protecting a part of himself. A part he thought he had lost forever on a blood-soaked battlefield long ago. The air crackled, not just with the lingering dust of the rock slide, but with a new tension, a different kind of threat, gathering on the horizon. Caleb squinted, his good eye narrowing against the setting sun. He saw them first, riders emerging from the heat haze, a dark line against the bleached landscape. Not Thorne's men, something else, something organized. "Company's coming," he grunted, nudging May. "And they ain't selling dry goods." As the riders drew closer, their features became clearer. They were Chinese, clad in dark, practical clothing, their faces grim and determined. Leading them was a man of imposing stature, his face etched with worry, but his eyes burning with a fierce intensity. He carried himself with an air of authority, a quiet strength that radiated outwards. "Jing," May whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "Uncle Jing." Caleb watched as Jing and his men approached, their horses kicking up dust devils in their wake. They dismounted with practiced ease, forming a line, their hands resting on the hilts of the swords, sheathed at their sides. These weren't gunslingers. These were warriors. Thorne and Slode, having finally navigated the rock slide, emerged into the clearing, their faces a mask of confusion to this and anger. "What in tarnation?" Thorne began, his voice trailing off, as he took in the scene. Jing stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Thorne. He spoke in heavily accented English, his voice resonating with authority. "You have something that belongs to my family. Release her." Thorne scoffed. "This ain't your business, Chinaman. This here's a private matter." He spat on the ground, a gesture of contempt. Jing's eyes narrowed. He drew his sword, the polished steel glinting in the dying light. "This is now my business. and you will release my niece or face the consequences." The air exploded with violence. Thorne, never one to back down from a fight, drew his revolver and fired. Jing deflected the bullet with his sword, the clang of metal echoing through the canyon. All hell broke loose. Caleb, shielding Mai behind him, drew his rifle and joined the fray. The canyon became a battlefield, a chaotic dance of gunfire and steel. Thorne's crude gunmanship was met with Jing's men's precision swordplay, a deadly ballet of clashing styles. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. Jebediah, dazed and injured from Caleb's earlier shot, tried to escape, but was quickly subdued by two of Jing's men, their swords flashing with lethal speed. Slade, Thorne's remaining lackey, fared no better, quickly overwhelmed and disarmed. Thorne, realizing the tide had turned against him, made a desperate attempt to flee. But Jing was too fast. He moved with a speed that belied his age, his sword a blur of motion. He disarmed Thorne, sending his revolver spinning into the dust. Thorne, defeated and humiliated, fell to his knees. Jing stood over him, his sword pointed at his throat. "You have brought shame upon yourself and your family," Jing said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "You will answer for your crimes." But before Jing could deliver the final blow, Mai stepped forward. "Uncle, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Don't kill him. It's not worth it." Jing hesitated, his gaze softening as he looked at his niece. He lowered his sword, but his eyes remained hard. "He will be punished," he said, "but by my hand." He turned to his men. "Take him. We will deliver him to the authorities." The fight was over. The canyon was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the combatants and the soft sobs of May as she rushed into Jing's arms. They embraced, a long, heartfelt reunion filled with relief and gratitude. Caleb watched the scene unfold, his face etched with a mixture of satisfaction and weariness. The landscape was stained with blood, but a sense of justice, however imperfect, had prevailed. He had helped set things right, and that was enough. He leaned against a boulder, his strength failing him. He was just an old cowboy with one arm, but he had made a difference. And in the unforgiving landscape of the West, that was all that mattered. The last rays of the sun painted the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the scene of recent violence. Jing released Mai from his embrace, his gaze lingering on her face, searching for any sign of lasting harm. He then turned towards Caleb, his expression softening with gratitude. "You have saved my niece's life," Jing said, bowing his head slightly. "I'm in your debt. Name your price, and I will gladly pay it." Caleb straightened up, wincing slightly as he put weight on his injured leg. He shook his head, his gaze meeting Jing's. "Don't need your money, friend. Mai's safe. That's payment enough." Jing studied Caleb, his eyes sharp and perceptive. He saw the weariness etched on the old man's face, the lines of hardship and loss. But he also saw the strength, the unwavering resolve that had driven him to protect Mai. He saw something else, too, a connection between the two, an unspoken bond that transcended age and circumstance. "You have done more than simply save her life," Jing said, his voice low and thoughtful. "You have given her hope. You have shown her kindness in a world that has offered her little of either." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the desolate landscape. "This place, it is harsh. It offers little opportunity, little solace. My family, we have built a life in San Francisco, a community, a place where Mai can be safe, where she can learn and grow." He turned back to Caleb, his eyes filled with earnestness. "I see that you care for her, and I see that she trusts you. I would be honored if you would join us. Come to San Francisco. Start a new life. Leave this behind you." He gestured towards Caleb's missing arm. "There are doctors in San Francisco. Skilled healers. Perhaps they can ease your pain, help you find some measure of peace." Caleb's expression hardened. He looked down at his empty sleeve, a shadow of pain flickering across his face. He had learned to live with the loss, to bury the memories of Gettysburg. But Jing's words had stirred something within him, a longing for something more, a yearning for a life beyond the confines of this desolate land. He looked at May, her eyes wide with hope, her small hand reaching out to grasp his. He saw the potential for a brighter future, a chance for her to escape the shadows of her past. He saw the possibility of a family, a connection that he had thought lost forever. But he also saw the ghosts that haunted him, the memories that clung to him like burrs. He saw the faces of the men he had lost, the battles he had fought, the sacrifices he had made. He saw the weight of his past, a burden that he wasn't sure he could ever escape. He looked back at Jing, his face etched with indecision. "San Francisco," he said, his voice a low murmur. "It's a long way from here, and I'm an old dog, friend. Not sure I can learn new tricks." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the canyon, the setting sun casting long, dramatic shadows. "This land, it's in my blood. It's all I know. I'm not sure I'd fit in a city like San Francisco." He looked back at Mai, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. He wanted to protect her, to give her the life she deserved. But he wasn't sure he was the right person to do it. He wasn't sure he was strong enough to leave his past behind. The decision weighed heavily on him, a battle raging within his soul. He wanted to do what was right for May, but he also had to consider what was right for himself. He had to decide if he was willing to take a leap of faith, to embrace a new life, or if he was destined to remain forever bound to the ghosts of the past. Mai's grip tightened on Caleb's hand, her small fingers digging into his calloused skin. "Please, Caleb," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Come with us. Don't stay here alone." Her dark eyes, mirroring the twilight sky, held a depth of emotion that tugged at something deep within him. She saw him as a savior, a beacon in the storm that had ravaged her young life. He looked down at her, his heart aching with a tenderness he hadn't felt in decades. He wanted to shield her from the harsh realities of the world, to give her the future she deserved. But he was an old, broken man, haunted by ghosts and tethered to a land that had both scarred and sustained him. He met Jing's gaze, the man's eyes filled with a quiet understanding, a hint of impatience. "We leave at first light," Jing said, his voice firm but respectful. "The decision is yours, old friend. But Moi needs you. And perhaps you need her too." Caleb sighed, the sound a weary expulsion of air. He released Mai's hand, stepping away from her slightly, as if needing physical distance to wrestle with the turmoil within. He ran a hand over his weathered face, the rough skin grating against his palm. "San Francisco ain't for the likes of me, child," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I'm a desert rat, born and bred. This land, it's in my bones. I wouldn't know what to do with myself in a city like that." He gestured towards the vast expanse of the Badlands, the setting sun painting the jagged peaks in shades of fire and shadow. Out here I'm free. I answer to no one. I live by my own code." He paused, his gaze softening as he looked back at May. "But you deserve better. You deserve a home, a family, a chance to build a life. I just don't know if I'm the right man to give you that." May stepped forward, her eyes pleading, You are, Caleb. You already have. You saved me. You protected me. You showed me kindness when no one else would. Please, don't leave me now." Jing watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He understood Caleb's hesitation, the old man's fear of the unknown. He knew the pull of the West, the allure of its vast emptiness. But he also knew the importance of family, the need for connection and belonging. "The decision is yours, Caleb," Jing repeated, his voice gentle but firm. "But know this, Mai is family, and family sticks together. We will welcome you with open arms, but we will not force you to come. The choice is yours, and yours alone." Caleb stared out at the darkening landscape, the wind whispering through the canyons, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust. The silence of the West called to him, a siren song of solitude and freedom. He had spent his life wandering this land, seeking solace in its vastness, finding a strange comfort in its harshness. Could he leave it all behind? Could he abandon the only life he had ever known, for the sake of a little girl who had captured his heart? Could he face the unfamiliarity of a city, the constraints of civilization, the challenge of building a new life? He closed his eyes, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He saw the faces of his fallen comrades, the barren landscapes of his past, the empty spaces in his soul. He saw May's hopeful eyes, Jing's unwavering gaze, the promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. San Francisco, or the Badlands, family or solitude, hope, or the ghosts of the past. The choice was his, and the weight of it threatened to crush him. The wind howled, a mournful cry that echoed Caleb's inner turmoil. He opened his eyes, the last sliver of sun, dipping below the horizon, plunging the canyon into near darkness. He knew what he had to do. He turned back to Jing and May, his face etched with a newfound resolve. "All right," he said, his voice rough but firm. "I'll help you pack. Get you ready for the morning." He didn't meet May's gaze directly, couldn't bear to see the hope that would surely shine there. Instead, he busied himself with the practicalities, gathering their meager belongings, checking the wagon's axles, ensuring the horses were properly fed and watered. He worked in silence, his movements efficient and deliberate, each action a small act of farewell. Mai, sensing his decision, remained quiet, her face a mask of disappointment. Jing, however, nodded slowly, his eyes filled with understanding and respect. He knew that Caleb's choice wasn't made lightly, that it came from a place of deep-seated conviction. As the first rays of dawn kissed the canyon walls, the wagon was ready. Jing helped Mai climb aboard, his hands lingering on her shoulders, a silent blessing. He then turned to Caleb, extending his hand. "Thank you, old friend," he said, his voice sincere. "You have done more than you know. I will never forget your kindness." Caleb shook his hand, his grip firm. "Just take care of her," he said, his voice gruff. "She deserves a good life." He stepped back as Jing climbed onto the wagon, taking the reins. Mai looked at Caleb, her eyes filled with tears. She reached out her hand, as if wanting one last touch. Caleb hesitated for a moment, then took her hand in his. He squeezed it gently, a silent promise. "You be good now," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And don't forget about your old friend." Mai nodded, tears streaming down her face. She released his hand, and Jing flicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, slowly pulling away. Caleb watched as it disappeared over the horizon, a small speck against the vast landscape. He stood there for a long time, the wind whipping around him, the silence deafening. When the wagon was finally out of sight, He turned and walked back towards the remnants of their camp. He picked up a discarded blanket, a small square of worn fabric, the only evidence of their stay. He held it for a moment, the scent of May clinging to the fibers, then tossed it onto the dying embers of the campfire. He mounted his horse, turning it towards the town. As he rode, he glanced back at the empty canyon. It looked the same as it always had, desolate and unforgiving. But something had changed, something within him. He reached the saloon. As dusk settled, the familiar sounds of piano music and drunken laughter washing over him. He hitched his horse and walked inside, the smoky air filling his lungs. He nodded to the bartender, a silent acknowledgement, and took his usual seat at the far end of the bar. He ordered a whiskey, the amber liquid burning its way down his throat. He sat there in silence, nursing his drink, listening to the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, the clatter of cards. The loneliness was still there, a familiar ache in his chest. But it was different now. It wasn't the same soul-crushing emptiness he had felt before. There was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. He had made a choice, a difficult choice, but he knew it was the right one. He had given Mai a chance at a better life, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. And, in the unforgiving landscape of the West, that was a victory in itself. He was a silent cowboy, and he'd silently altered a life forever. The whiskey warmed Caleb's insides, but it didn't touch the chill in his soul. He sat, a silent sentinel, the saloon's dim light catching the lines etched deep into his face. The usual ruckus swirled around him. Card games, boasts, and the mournful strains of a piano. He was a part of it, yet utterly detached, a ghost in his own life. He reached for his glass, his hand brushing against something small and hard. He looked down. It was a bird, carved from wood, no bigger than his thumb. Intricate details brought it to life. Tiny feathers, a delicate beak, eyes that seemed to hold a spark of their own. He picked it up, turning it over in his calloused fingers. He knew instantly where it came from. Mai. She must have slipped it into his pocket. A silent farewell, a token of gratitude. A lump formed in his throat, a feeling he hadn't experienced in decades. He remembered her small hands, the way she would watch the birds soaring above the canyon, her eyes filled with a longing for freedom. He remembered how she'd tried to carve a bird from a piece of driftwood, her small fingers clumsy but determined. This bird, this was different. This was a masterpiece, clearly not her work. It was probably something Jing had brought from San Francisco, a reminder of a life beyond the dust and grit of the West, a life May deserved. He set the bird on the bar, in front of him, its tiny form a stark contrast to the rough-hewn wood and the spilled whiskey. It seemed fragile, out of place in the harsh environment. But it was also beautiful, a testament to the enduring power of hope. The bartender, a burly man named Jed, shuffled over, wiping down the counter with a rag. He glanced at the bird, then at Caleb, his expression curious. "Pretty little thing," Jed rumbled, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Where'd you get it?" Caleb didn't answer, just took another sip of his whiskey. Jed shrugged and moved on, understanding Caleb's silence. Most folks in Redemption knew better than to pry. But the bird had changed something. It was a seed of hope, planted in the barren landscape of Caleb's heart. He was still alone, still haunted by his past, but he wasn't entirely empty. He had helped May, given her a chance at a better life. And she, in turn, had given him something he thought he had lost forever. A reason to believe in the possibility of kindness, even in the darkest of times. The saloon doors swung open, a gust of wind and dust swirling inside. A couple of cowboys stumbled in, their faces flushed with drink. The piano player struck up a lively tune, and the noise level rose another notch. Caleb ignored it all. He stared at the wooden bird, its tiny form bathed in the warm glow of the lantern light. It was a reminder that even in the harshest landscapes, life could bloom. That even a silent cowboy could make a difference. Finished his whiskey and stood up, pushing his chair back with a scrape. He nodded to Jed, a silent farewell, and walked out into the night. The wind was still howling, but it didn't sound quite so mournful now. It sounded almost hopeful. He carried that hope with him, a small wooden bird, nestled in the depths of his weathered soul. Back to his solitary existence, but not the same as before. Years drifted by, marked by the relentless sun and the shifting sands of the Badlands. Redemption, once a dying speck on the map, clung to life, fueled by the promise of the railroad inching its way westward. New faces arrived, drawn by whispers of opportunity, and the town slowly, grudgingly, began to heal. Caleb, too, aged. The lines on his face deepened, etched by time and hardship. His hair turned the color of bleached bone, and his movements grew slower, more deliberate. But his eyes, those steely blue eyes, retained their sharpness, their unwavering gaze. He still spent his days tending his small ranch, mending fences, and caring for his horses. He was a familiar figure in redemption, a silent observer, a weathered landmark. He rarely spoke, but his presence was felt, a quiet strength that permeated the town. He'd heard whispers, snippets of news carried on the wind, about San Francisco. Jing and Mai were doing well. Mai was going to school, learning to read and write. Jing had opened a small laundry, catering to the growing Chinese population. The news warmed him, a small ember glowing in his heart. One morning, as the sun crested the jagged peaks, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Caleb stood on his porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. He watched the light spread across the land, chasing away the shadows, revealing the beauty hidden within the harshness. A smile touched his lips, a rare and precious sight. It wasn't a smile of joy, not exactly. It was a smile of contentment, of acceptance. He had made his choice, and he had lived with it. He had stayed in the Badlands, in the only place he had ever truly felt alive. But he had also helped May, given her a chance at a better future. And that was enough. Redemption was becoming a haven, a refuge for the lost and the forgotten, a place where outcasts could find a home, where wanderers could find a purpose. It wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. There were still fights, still robberies, still plenty of heartache. But there was also a growing sense of community, a willingness to help each other, to look out for one another. He saw it in the way the townsfolk rallied around a family whose farm had been ravaged by a fire. He saw it in the way the saloon owner offered a free meal to a hungry traveler. He saw it in the way the children played together, regardless of their race or background. His act of courage, his silent decision to help May, had rippled outwards, creating a small oasis of compassion in a world often defined by cruelty. He hadn't set out to change the world. He had simply done what he thought was right. But his actions had had an impact, a profound and lasting impact. He raised his mug to the rising sun, a silent toast to the future, to the promise of a new day. He knew that the West was still wild, still dangerous, but he also knew that even in the heart of the wilderness, something beautiful could grow from the dust, that even a broken man could make a difference. He was a silent cowboy, and he'd learned that silence could be a powerful force, that even the smallest act of kindness could change the course of a life. And as he watched the sunrise paint the desert in its glory, he knew that his life, his solitary life, had meaning. He had touched the world, however subtly, and left it a little bit brighter than he found it. The desert wind whispered his name, a silent blessing, a testament to the enduring power of hope. He was Caleb, and he was home.